A single sentence can be a key turning a lock you never knew existed. For Eliza Holloway, a 24-year-old waitress drowning in her mother's medical bills, that sentence was a simple observation. For Gideon Pierce, a man insulated from the world by billions of dollars, it was a crack in the foundation of his entire life. She was just trying to get through her shift. He was just another faceless tycoon in a suit. But when she saw the ring on his finger, a flicker of a memory became an inferno that would threaten to burn down a century-old dynasty. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the story of how a casual remark in a cheap diner unraveled a web of lies, betrayal, and a secret that one of America's most powerful families thought was buried forever. The fluorescent lights of the corner booth, diner, hummed a monotonous tune, a sound Eliza Holloway knew better than her own heartbeat. It was the soundtrack to her life, the sizzle of burgers on the griddle, the clatter of cheap ceramic plates, the low murmur of conversations that never seemed to change. At 9:00 p.m. on a Tuesday, the diner was in its nightly lull, a brief respite between the dinner rush and the late-night crowd. Eliza leaned against the cool stainless steel counter, rolling her shoulders to work out a knot of exhaustion. Every muscle ached with a fatigue that was more than physical. It was the soul-deep weariness of watching her mother Laura slowly fade in a sterile beige hospital room. The bell above the door chimed, pulling Eliza from her thoughts. A man stepped inside, and an invisible curtain of silence seemed to fall over the diner. He wasn't just well-dressed, he was sculpted from a different material than the rest of the world. His suit, a charcoal grey, so dark it was nearly black, fit him with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. His shoes gleamed even under the diner's grimy lights. He had the kind of quiet, absolute confidence that doesn't need to be announced. It simply is. The few remaining patrons instinctively lowered their voices. He chose a booth in the corner, sliding onto the cracked vinyl seat with an economy of motion. Eliza grabbed a menu and a glass of water, her professional smile pasted on. "Welcome to the corner booth. Can I get you started with something?" The man didn't look at the menu. His eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, met hers for a brief, dismissive moment. "Just coffee. Black." His voice was low and resonant, a cello in a room of tin whistles. "Coming right up," Eliza said, retreating to the counter. Her friend and fellow waitress Chloe sidled up to her. "Get a load of Mr. Moneybags. Thinks he's too good for a menu. $10, says he's Gideon Pierce." Eliza frowned as she poured the coffee. "Who?" "Gideon Pierce. Pierce Holdings International. They own half the downtown skyline. My dad used to be a foreman on one of their sites before he got laid off. That guy's picture is in the business section every other week. They say he's ruthless. Turned his family's millions into billions before he was 30. Eliza glanced over at the man. He was staring out the window, his profile sharp and severe against the neon-lit street. He looked less like a businessman and more like a predator resting between hunts. She picked up the cup and saucer. "Well, to me, he's just another customer who wants black coffee." She walked back to the booth and set the coffee down. "Here you are, sir." As he reached for the cup, his hand emerged from his cufflink-adorned sleeve, and on his right ring finger, nestled against his skin, was a ring that made Eliza's breath catch in her throat. It wasn't the size or the gleam of it that stopped her. It was the design. An intricate masculine signet ring made of a pale buttery gold. Etched into the flat face was a sigil, a stylized phoenix, its wings spread wide, with a single tiny sapphire set in its eye, sparkling like a captured star. The band itself was unique, carved to look like intertwined feathers. Eliza's mind reeled. She saw the same ring, not gleaming under a diner light, but resting in a small velvet-lined box on her mother's bedside table. Laura's ring was identical in every detail, down to the tiny, impossibly blue sapphire eye. It was her most cherished possession, the one thing she'd refused to sell, even when the medical bills became a tidal wave threatening to drown them. Her father, she'd always said, had given it to her on his deathbed. "It's a promise, Eliza," she would whisper, her voice thin and reedy. "A promise of what's right." The words tumbled out of Eliza's mouth before she could stop them, a quiet, stunned whisper. "Hi, sir. My mother has a ring just like yours." Gideon Pierce froze his hand, hovering over the coffee cup. He slowly retracted it, and his piercing blue eyes lifted to meet hers. The casual dismissal was gone, replaced by a sudden, glacial intensity. He didn't speak. He simply stared, his gaze so sharp and analytical, it felt like he was dissecting her, searching for the punchline to a joke she wasn't telling. "Excuse me," he finally said, his voice, dropping an octave, becoming dangerously soft. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. She felt Chloe's worried stare from across the room. She should have just walked away, kept her mouth shut. But the image of her mother's frail hand, clutching that identical ring, was burned into her mind. "The ring," she stammered, pointing a trembling finger. "On your hand. It's the same as my mother's. The phoenix, the little sapphire. Everything." A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, not surprise, not recognition, but something harder, darker. He slowly turned his hand over, examining the ring as if seeing it for the first time. "That's impossible," he stated. It wasn't a guess, it was a verdict. "But it's not," Eliza insisted, her voice gaining a desperate edge. "She's had it my whole life. Her father gave it to her. It's one of a kind," he told her. Gideon Pierce placed his hand flat on the table, the ring, a silent, golden accusation. His gaze was cold steel. "This ring," he said, enunciating each word with chilling precision, "has been in the Pierce family for over 100 years. It was custom-made for my great-grandfather, Alaric Pierce. There is no other. There has never been another. You are mistaken." The finality in his tone felt like a slap. He was calling her a liar, or worse, a fool. The injustice of it piled on top of her exhaustion, and fear for her mother ignited a spark of defiance in her. "I'm not mistaken," she said, her voice low but firm. "I've held it in my hands 1,000 times. I know every detail on it. I could draw it from memory." He leaned back, a faint, condescending smile touching his lips. It didn't reach his eyes. "A fascinating story. What is your name?" "Eliza. Eliza Holloway." "Well, Miss Holloway," he said, picking up his coffee cup and taking a slow, deliberate sip. "Your mother is either a liar or a thief, because the only way she has a ring like this is if it's the one that was stolen from my family 50 years ago." He set the cup down with a soft click. The sound echoed in the sudden silence of Eliza's world. Stolen. The word hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Her mother, the gentlest, most honest person she knew, a thief. The accusation was so absurd, so vile, it was like being told the sun rose in the west. Gideon Pierce reached into his suit jacket, pulled out a slim leather wallet, and extracted 3 $100 bills, placing them on the table. It was more than she made in 2 shifts. It was an insult, a dismissal, for the coffee and your time. He said, his eyes already looking past her toward the door. He stood up, the power of his presence filling the small booth. He was already gone, moving on, leaving her in the wreckage of his words. As he walked toward the exit, Eliza found her voice. "She's not a thief. He paused at the door, his back to her. He didn't turn around, but his voice carried clearly across the quiet diner. "Then prove it." The bell chimed again, and he was gone, leaving Eliza standing in the middle of the corner booth, her heart pounding, the hum of the lights now sounding like a scream. The 3 crisp bills on the table felt like blood money. She hadn't just served coffee to a billionaire. She had stumbled into his story, and in doing so, she realized with a cold dread, she may have just destroyed her own. The drive to the hospital was a blur of traffic lights and the anxious thumping of her own heart. Gideon Pierce's words echoed in her head, a liar or a thief. It was preposterous. Laura Holloway was a woman who would walk back into a store to return a few cents of extra change. The accusation was a poison dart, and Eliza felt its venom spreading through her. She found her mother sleeping, her face pale and sunken, against the pristine white of the hospital pillow. The ever-present beep of the cardiac monitor was a fragile, rhythmic reassurance. On the small bedside table next to a glass of water and a well-worn book of poetry sat the small, dark blue velvet box. With trembling hands, Eliza picked it up. The velvet was worn smooth in places. She opened the lid. There it was. The pale gold ring catching the low light from the hallway, the phoenix with its proud spread wings, and the eye a tiny sapphire that seemed to hold a universe of secrets. It was identical. There was no question. "Eliza, honey, is that you?" Laura's voice was weak, raspy. Eliza quickly shut the box and turned, forcing a smile. "Hey, Mom, I didn't mean to wake you. You're late. Rough shift." Laura's eyes, though clouded with illness, were still sharp, still full of a fierce love that had been Eliza's anchor her entire life. The usual. Eliza couldn't bring herself to tell the truth. How could she voice such a monstrous accusation to this frail woman? "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been run over by a very slow, very expensive truck," Laura said with a weak smile. The doctors were in. More talk of options. It all sounds the same. She shifted in the bed, wincing, and her eyes fell on the box in Eliza's hand. Her expression changed. The weariness was replaced by a familiar, guarded look. "You were looking at the ring." Eliza hesitated. "I was just thinking about it. About Dad." Laura's hand, thin and crisscrossed with blue veins, reached out, and she patted the mattress beside her. Eliza sat down. "Your grandfather," Laura corrected gently as she always did. "It was my father who gave it to me, not yours." Eliza's father had been a good man, a mechanic who died in a workshop accident when she was 10, leaving behind nothing but debts and happy memories. The ring predated him. "Right, Granddad," Eliza said, her mind racing. "Mom, tell me about him again. About the ring." Laura's gaze drifted to the window to the dark sky outside. "There's not much to tell that you haven't heard. My father Owen was a quiet man, a brilliant man, an engineer. He worked for a big corporation back east. He said the ring was payment for a promise that was broken by powerful men." "What kind of promise?" Eliza pressed, trying to keep her voice casual. "He never said, only that it was about recognizing what was right. He made me swear to never sell it to keep it safe. He said one day it might be the only proof we have." "Proof of what?" A flicker of fear, real and raw, crossed Laura's face. She looked at Eliza, her eyes pleading. "Leave it be, Eliza. It's an old story. A sad story. It has nothing to do with us anymore. Some doors are best left closed." "But, Mum, what if someone else has a reason to open that door?" The words were out before she could stop them. Laura's grip on her hand tightened. "What do you mean? What happened?" Eliza saw the spike on the heart monitor and cursed herself. Nothing. It's nothing, just a stupid thing at work. She couldn't burden her mother with this. Not now. She needed to protect her. But the seed of doubt had been planted, a promise that was broken by powerful men. Who were they, and what did any of it have to do with Gideon Pierce? Miles away, in a penthouse apartment that seemed to float above the city, Gideon Pierce stood before a floor-to-ceiling window. The city lights spread out below him like a carpet of scattered diamonds. He held a glass of scotch, the amber liquid untouched. He hadn't been able to shake the encounter at the diner. The girl, Eliza Holloway, her wide, honest eyes, her absolute certainty. My mother has a ring just like yours. It was ludicrous. And yet... He walked over to a heavy mahogany desk and switched on a green-shaded lamp. From a locked drawer he retrieved a leather-bound folio. The Pierce family archives. It was a curated, sanitized history, of course, but it was all he had. He opened it to the section on family heirlooms. There, on a yellowed page, was a photograph of the ring. His ring. The description was clear. The Phoenix Signet. Commissioned in 1922 by Alaric Pierce. Forged by artisan Michel Dubois of Paris. Unique design. Symbol of the Pierce family's rebirth from the ashes of the 1921 financial panic. Sole ownership passed down to the male heir of each generation. His father had given him the ring on his 21st birthday. It represents our resilience, Gideon. He'd said, his voice thick with pride. We always rise. Never forget that. Gideon's phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at the screen. Genevieve Adler. He answered. Adler. You're still up, came a crisp, no-nonsense voice. Genevieve Adler was more than his lawyer. She was his fixer, the executor of his will and the keeper of his secrets. Something has come up, Gideon said, his voice tight. I need you to run a background check. Discreetly. Another hostile takeover. A person. Her name is Eliza Holloway. She works at a diner on 6th Street called The Corner Booth. Her mother's name is Laura Holloway. I want to know everything. Financials, family history, where they came from, who their people were. Everything. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Genevieve was too professional to ask why, but he could feel her curiosity. Is this a personal or professional matter? Gideon looked at the ring on his finger, the phoenix staring back at him with its cold sapphire eye. I'm not sure yet, he admitted, a rare moment of uncertainty. But it has the potential to become problematic. He thought back to the story his grandfather used to tell a story, told only in hushed tones after a few too many brandies. About Alaric Pierce's younger brother Daniel, how Daniel had betrayed the family, tried to steal Alaric's designs for a new kind of turbine engine, and in his greed had taken the spare signet ring Alaric had foolishly commissioned. Daniel, the story went, was disowned, cast out. And the ring was lost with him, a symbol of treachery. But the official family history, the one in the folio, never mentioned a second ring. It never mentioned a brother named Daniel. It was a ghost story, a family legend. Until now. Find out who Laura Holloway's father was. Gideon commanded, his voice hardening again, the moment of uncertainty passing. I want his name. I want to know what he did for a living. And I want to know if he ever, for any reason, crossed paths with my family. He hung up the phone. The waitress had said her grandfather gave her mother the ring. A quiet engineer. Broken promises. Powerful men. For the first time in a very long time, Gideon Pierce felt a sliver of something other than control. It felt like walking on thin ice, hearing the first faint crackle of it, giving way beneath his feet. He had told the girl to prove it. But now he realized with a grim certainty he had to do the same. He had to prove his own story was the truth. 3 days later, the name arrived in a single encrypted line of text from Genevieve Adler Owen Calloway. The name meant nothing to Gideon. He ran it through the private databases of Pierce Holdings, cross-referencing it with employee records, contractor lists, and financial dealings going back a century. Nothing. No Owen Calloway had ever worked for or with his family's company. He felt a wave of relief, quickly followed by suspicion. It was too clean. He was stewing in his office, a vast expanse of glass and steel on the 80th floor, when Genevieve herself appeared at his door. She was a severe woman in her 50s, always dressed in impeccably tailored suits, her grey hair pulled back in a tight chignon. She held a thin file. "You're not going to like this," she said, forgoing any greeting. She placed the file on his desk. Gideon opened it. Inside were public records. A birth certificate for Laura Ann Calloway, born in Wilmington, Delaware. Father Owen Calloway. Mother Helen Calloway. And then another document, a patent application from 1968. Inventor Owen Calloway. Invention a novel gearing system for high-torque industrial turbines. Assignee of patent none. Application withdrawn. Gideon's blood ran cold. He recognized the schematic. It was a primitive but unmistakable precursor to the Pierce Mark III turbine, the very invention that had catapulted his grandfather's company from a regional player into a global powerhouse in the early 70s. The invention credited solely to his grandfather, William Pierce. The application was withdrawn on October 12, 1968. Genevieve said, her voice flat. According to banking records I accessed on October 14, 1968, Owen Calloway made a one-time cash deposit of $50,000 into his savings account, a significant sum for an engineer at the time. He quit his job a week later, moved his family, and never worked in engineering again. He died of a heart attack 6 years later, at the age of 42. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. A non-disclosure agreement, a cash payoff, a brilliant idea bought and buried under the Pierce name. So he was bought off. Gideon said the words, tasting like ash. My grandfather stole his invention and paid him to keep quiet. It appears that way, Genevieve confirmed. The $50,000 was likely positioned as a consulting fee to keep it legal. There's no paper trail linking it directly to the patent, of course. Your grandfather was meticulous. And the ring? Gideon asked, looking at his own hand. That, Genevieve said, is where it gets strange. I found the jeweler who bought the assets of Dubois et Fils of Paris. The records are ancient, but their ledgers were like your grandfather, meticulous. In 1922, Alaric Pierce commissioned 2 identical Phoenix signet rings. He paid for both. There's a note in the margin in the artisan's hand. She slid a translated copy across the desk. It read, "One for the builder, one for the dreamer. May they fly together." 2 rings. The family ghost story wasn't a story. It was true. His great-uncle Daniel existed. So Calloway didn't steal the ring, Gideon murmured, thinking aloud. Daniel Pierce, the disowned brother, must have given it to him. But why? As a thank you, a token for a friend, or something more? The puzzle was no longer about a simple diner waitress. It was about the very bedrock of his family's legacy. It was built not just on resilience but on a lie. The knowledge was a corrosive acid in his gut. He had to speak to her again. Eliza was wiping down the counter at the end of another grueling shift when the bell on the door chimed. Her heart sank. It was him. Gideon Pierce didn't enter the diner this time. He stood in the doorway, the city lights framing him like a dark halo. He was dressed more casually in dark trousers and a cashmere sweater, but he still radiated an unapproachable aura of power. "Ms. Holloway," he said, his voice quiet but carrying. "I need to speak with you." Chloe shot her a nervous look. "Eliza, you don't have to." But Eliza knew she did. She untied her apron and hung it on its hook. "It's okay. I'll be right back." She stepped out into the cool night air. The street was loud with the sounds of the city, a stark contrast to the tense silence that fell between them. "Your mother's father." Gideon began getting straight to the point. His name was Owen Calloway. It wasn't a question. Eliza flinched. How did he know that? Yes. What of it? He was an engineer. In 1968, he filed a patent for a turbine gear system. Gideon watched her face, carefully gauging her reaction. Eliza's mind went blank. She knew her grandfather was an engineer, but the details were a fog. Her mother never spoke of his work, only of his sadness. "I don't know anything about that," she said honestly. "I think you do." Gideon countered, his voice sharp with impatience. "Or your mother does. My grandfather, William Pierce, launched a turbine based on an identical design a few years later. It made my family a fortune. Calloway withdrew his patent and accepted a cash payment. This isn't about a stolen ring anymore, is it, Ms. Holloway? This is about a shakedown. Is that your plan? Use this old story to leverage a payday for your mother's medical bills?" The accusation was so cynical, so cruel, it knocked the air from her lungs. Tears of pure rage and frustration sprang to her eyes. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "You stand there in your $1,000 sweater looking down on us. My mother is fighting for her life. You think this is about money. This is about her honor. The honor of a man you just admitted your family probably robbed." For the first time, Gideon looked taken aback. He saw not a schemer, but a daughter pushed to her breaking point. "My grandfather told my mother that ring was proof." Eliza continued, her voice rising. "Proof that he was wronged. He didn't take a payoff, he was threatened, forced to sign away his life's work, to protect his family from men like your grandfather. That money wasn't a payment. It was hush money to ensure he never spoke of it again." She was channeling her mother's long-held, unspoken pain. The words felt true, solid, righteous. Gideon was silent for a long moment, the sounds of the city rushing in to fill the space between them. His own certainty was eroding, replaced by the disquieting possibility that the waitress's version of the story, a tale of threats and coercion, was closer to the truth than the sanitized version of a simple business transaction he had constructed. "There were 2 rings," he said, his voice losing its hard edge. "My great-grandfather had 2 made. One for him and one for his brother, Daniel. The family story is that Daniel was a traitor who was cast out." He looked at her, his blue eyes searching her face. "Was your grandfather friends with a man named Daniel Pierce?" Eliza stared at him, bewildered. "Daniel Pierce, I've never heard that name in my life." They were at an impasse. 2 families, 2 rings, and 2 completely different histories that intersected at a single disputed point in the past. One story of a clean, if ruthless, business deal, another of theft and intimidation. And at the center of it all, a ghost named Daniel Pierce, and a ring that was supposed to be a promise. "My mother has the ring," Eliza said, her resolve hardening. "You have your story, I have mine, and I'm going to find out which one is true." Gideon gave a single sharp nod. The condescension was gone, replaced by a grudging respect. "So am I." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the city's shadows, leaving Eliza with the chilling realization that their quest for the truth was now inextricably and dangerously linked. The confrontation with Gideon Pierce left Eliza shaken but resolute. She had defended her family's honor, but his questions echoed in her mind. Daniel Pierce. The name was a blank slate. She returned to the hospital the next day with a new sense of urgency. She found Laura sitting up, looking a little stronger than the day before. The poetry book was open on her lap. "Mum," Eliza began, pulling a chair close. "We need to talk. For real this time. No more secrets." Laura sighed a long, weary sound and closed the book. "I knew this day would come. Seeing you with the box, I knew you wouldn't let it go." She looked at her daughter, her eyes full of a deep, ancient sorrow. "What did he say to you?" "He?" Eliza asked, feigning ignorance. "Don't play coy, Eliza," the man from the diner. "You think a man like Gideon Pierce makes a scene, and it doesn't get noticed. Chloe called me. She was worried sick." Eliza's shoulders slumped. "He found me. He knows about Grandad Owen. He thinks we're trying to blackmail him. He thinks Grandad sold his invention to the Pierce family." Laura's expression hardened. "Sold it, is that what they call it?" She scoffed a bitter, rattling sound. "Your grandfather was a genius, Eliza. A gentle, trusting soul who thought the world worked on merit and good faith. He was working at a large firm, a competitor to Pierce Industries at the time. He developed his turbine gearing system on his own time. It was his masterpiece." She paused, her gaze, distant, lost in the memory. "He made the mistake of mentioning it to a colleague trusting him. That colleague left the company 2 months later for a senior position at Pierce Industries. 6 months after that, your grandfather received a visit from 2 men. They weren't lawyers. They were persuaders. They worked for William Pierce." The sterile hospital room suddenly felt cold. "What did they do?" Eliza whispered. "They didn't lay a hand on him," Laura said, her voice dropping. "They were smarter than that. They laid out photographs on our kitchen table. Pictures of me playing in the schoolyard. Pictures of your grandmother leaving the grocery store. They told him what a beautiful family he had. And they told him it would be a shame if something were to happen to them. Then they put a stack of papers in front of him. A non-disclosure agreement and a contract assigning all rights to his invention to a shell corporation owned by Pierce Industries. And an envelope full of cash. The story was uglier than Eliza could have imagined. This wasn't business. It was gangster tactics. "He signed everything," Laura continued, her voice trembling. "What choice did he have? He took the money because refusing it would have been an act of defiance, and he was too scared to defy them. We moved a week later. He was a broken man, Eliza. They didn't just steal his work, they stole his soul. He died 6 years later, but the truth is, they killed him that day in our kitchen." Tears streamed down Eliza's face. She finally understood the deep well of sadness in her mother, the fear behind her warnings. "But the ring, Mom," Eliza pressed gently. "Where does the ring come into it? Who is Daniel Pierce?" Laura flinched at the name, a genuine startled reaction. "Where did you hear that name?" "Gideon told me. He said his great-grandfather had 2 rings made, one for himself and one for his brother Daniel, who was disowned." Laura was silent for a full minute, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Daniel, Owen never said the name Pierce. He only ever called him my friend. His only friend in that terrible time." She began to recount a different part of the story, one she'd never shared. After Owen was forced out, he fell into a deep depression. But one man sought him out. a man who introduced himself only as Daniel. He was a drifter, an outcast, but he had an artist's soul and a hatred for the kind of corporate greed that had destroyed Owen. He had heard what happened to Owen through the engineering grapevine. This Daniel, Laura recounted, told your grandfather that he too had been betrayed by a powerful family. He understood what it was to have everything stolen by your own blood. They became friends, two broken men finding solace in each other's company. Before Daniel left town for good, he gave Owen the ring. She looked at Eliza, her eyes intense. He told Owen this was meant to symbolize a shared dream between brothers. It was forged in hope and tainted by greed. It belongs to the wronged, not the wrongdoer. Keep it as proof that integrity has a value that money can't buy. One day, the phoenix will rise for the right person. Owen cherished that ring more than the invention itself. It was a symbol that he wasn't alone in his suffering. So Daniel Pierce wasn't a traitor. He was another victim, and he had given the ring his own birthright to another wronged man as an act of solidarity. The story was so much more profound, so much more tragic than Gideon's cold family ledger. At the same time, Gideon was in his family's ancestral home, a sprawling stone estate an hour outside the city. He rarely came here. It felt more like a museum than a home filled with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. In the library, a room panelled in dark wood that smelled of old paper and polish, he met his cousin, Robert Pierce. Robert was a few years older with a practiced smile and the easy charm of a man who had never worked a day in his life. He managed the family's charitable foundation, a role that required him to attend galas and cut ribbons. "Gideon, to what do we owe the honor?" Robert said, pouring 2 glasses of brandy. "Tired of the concrete jungle. I'm looking for information." "Robert," Gideon said, cutting to the chase. "About great-uncle Daniel." Robert's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Daniel, the black sheep, that old ghost story. What's gotten into you?" "I have reason to believe the story is true, and I need to know the details. The real details, not the sanitized version." Robert swirled the brandy in his snifter, suddenly looking thoughtful. "Well, you know the legend. He was the younger brother, the artist, the dreamer. Alaric was the pragmatist, the builder. Daniel apparently accused Alaric of stealing his ideas for the company's early successes. Tried to stage a boardroom coup. When it failed, he vanished, but not before stealing a valuable ring and supposedly selling company secrets to a rival. Robert sighed dramatically. A classic tale of sibling rivalry and betrayal. It's why the line of succession has always been so rigidly defined, to prevent another Daniel. This was the story Gideon had always known, but hearing it now, it felt thin, theatrical, a convenient narrative to justify Alaric's consolidation of power. "And you believe that?" Gideon asked. "Why shouldn't I?" "It's our history," Robert said with a shrug. "It's a bit dramatic, sure, but it explains why the family closed ranks, why Grandpa William was so aggressive in his business dealings. He was protecting the family legacy from vultures from another betrayal." He leaned forward, his voice conspiratorial. Why the sudden interest? Did one of his descendants crawl out of the woodwork looking for a handout? The question was casual, but the look in Robert's eyes was sharp, probing. Gideon felt a sudden instinctual distrust. Robert had always seemed vapid, but perhaps that was a carefully constructed facade. "It's a private matter," Gideon said, his voice clipped. Of course," Robert said, leaning back, the charming smile returning. "Well, if you want to dig up old bones, be my guest. The old family papers are in the West Wing study. Gramps Williams' private correspondence. Knock yourself out. Just don't be surprised if the ghost you find is uglier than you imagined." Gideon left Robert with his brandy and went to the study. The room was dusty, unused for years. He found the boxes of letters tied with faded ribbon. For hours he sorted through them, reading his grandfather's elegant cursive script. Most of it was business. But then he found a series of letters from the late 1960s addressed to his grandfather's head of security. The content made him feel ill. There were updates on the surveillance of a man named Owen Calloway, reports on his daughter's school schedule, his wife's daily routine, and then a final chilling memo. Subject Calloway has been neutralized. Asset secured. He is no longer a threat. Neutralized. Asset secured. Eliza Holloway's story was true. It was all true. His family's fortune was built on theft and cemented with threats. The weight of the discovery was crushing. But as he continued to sift through the papers, he found something else. Something that didn't fit either his story or Eliza's. It was a single folded note, separate from the letters tucked into the back of a ledger. It was in his grandfather William's handwriting, but it was frantic, almost illegible. He knows. R found him. He can ruin everything. Daniel is the key. Must protect the name. The note was undated. Who was he, and who was R. Robert? It seemed too convenient. And what did it mean? Daniel is the key. Daniel was supposed to be a ghost, a long-vanished traitor. But this note, written decades after Daniel's disappearance, spoke of him as a present active threat. Gideon stood in the dusty, silent study, holding two conflicting testaments. In one hand, the sordid truth of his grandfather's crime against Owen Calloway. In the other, a cryptic note that suggested a deeper, more complex conspiracy was at play. The story was no longer just about his grandfather and Eliza's. There was a third player, a hidden thread. And the name of that thread was Daniel. The discovery of his grandfather's note threw Gideon into a state of focused obsession. He knows. R found him. Daniel is the key. It was a cipher, and Gideon knew he couldn't crack it alone. The animosity between him and Eliza had melted away, replaced by the grim reality that they were the only two people with a stake in the complete truth. He found her where he knew she'd be, in the hospital cafeteria, staring into a cup of coffee with the same haunted expression he saw in the mirror. He sat down opposite her, placing a thin file on the table between them. "Your mother was right," he said, his voice devoid of its usual authority, filled instead with a quiet gravity. "About everything. The threats, the coercion. My grandfather put your family through hell." He pushed the file forward. It contained the copies of the surveillance reports on the Calloway family. "This is the proof." Eliza opened the file, her hands trembling as she read the cold clinical descriptions of her mother as a little girl being watched. Her face paled. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of vindication and horror. "Why are you showing me this? Because my story is falling apart, and so is yours," Gideon said. "There's more to it." He told her about the note. Daniel is the key. It was written by my grandfather, William, long after your grandfather was silenced. He was scared of someone who knew the truth about Daniel. Eliza frowned. But Daniel gave my grandfather the ring. He was an outcast, a victim like Owen. "That's what he told your grandfather," Gideon countered. But what if that wasn't the whole story? What if Daniel's disappearance wasn't just about him being cast out? We have two stories, yours and mine, but they're both based on what we were told by people who were themselves betrayed or lying. We need a primary source, an objective truth. "Where do we find that?" Eliza asked, the weight of a multi-generational conspiracy settling on her shoulders. "The rings." Gideon said, a spark of inspiration in his eyes. They're the one constant. They're the origin point. My great-grandfather Alaric commissioned them from a Parisian artisan, Michel Dubois. The business is gone, but I found the firm that acquired its assets, and more importantly, its records. The ledgers. In Paris. Eliza's heart sank. That was a world away. I had the relevant pages scanned and sent over this morning, Gideon said, tapping his phone. The high-resolution images are waiting in my office. I need another set of eyes. Your eyes. You know your ring better than anyone. An hour later, Eliza found herself in a place she could never have imagined, Gideon Pierce's office on the 80th floor. The silence was absolute, the view of the city breathtaking. On a massive screen that covered one wall was a high-resolution image of a page from an old leather-bound ledger. The script was elegant, spidery French. A translated transcript scrolled beside it. They pored over the entry for Alaric Pierce's 1922 commission. As Genevieve had discovered, it listed 2 identical rings. But as they zoomed in on the artisan's original French notes, Eliza saw something the translator had missed. The translator's note read, "One for the builder, one for the dreamer." But the original French was more specific. Eliza had taken 4 years of French in high school, and while she was rusty, one phrase jumped out at her. L'un pour le bâtisseur de l'Empire, l'autre pour le gardien de l'âme. That's not dreamer, Eliza said, slowly pointing at the screen. Gardien de l'âme. It means guardian of the soul. Gideon zoomed in, reading the phrase. Guardian of the soul. He repeated the words, feeling heavy and significant. A builder of an empire and a guardian of its soul. It wasn't a rivalry. It was meant to be a partnership, a balance. This changed everything. Alaric and Daniel weren't meant to be competitors. They were meant to be 2 halves of a whole. The story of Daniel's betrayal was a complete fabrication. As they scanned further down the page, Gideon noticed a small annotation next to the entry, added in a different hand, and with different ink. It was dated 1945. "What's this?" he murmured, enlarging the note. The French was spidery and difficult to read. Reçu une lettre de Monsieur Daniel Pierce. The note began. Received a letter from Mr. Daniel Pierce. Gideon translated haltingly. He asks for a modification to the second ring, to the inside of the band. He is no longer a Pierce. He is something else. Gideon and Eliza exchanged a look. No longer a Pierce, Eliza whispered. He changed his name, Gideon realized. When he was cast out, he abandoned the family name entirely. The note continued. Il a demandé que j'inscrive un nom. Le nom Owen. He asked me to inscribe a name. Gideon read his voice, catching. The name Owen. Eliza gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Owen, my grandfather's name. But this was in 1945. My grandfather wouldn't have met Daniel for another 20 years. It's not your grandfather's name, Gideon said, a sudden shocking realization dawning on him. He typed furiously on his keyboard, pulling up his family's genealogy records, going back further than he ever had before. His fingers flew, his mind racing. He found his great-grandfather, Alaric Pierce. Then his great-grandmother, Beatrice. And then he found her family tree. Her maiden name was Beaumont. And her father, Alaric's father-in-law, his name was Owen Beaumont, a wealthy shipping magnate who had bankrolled Alaric's early ventures, who had died in 1944. The truth hit them both like a physical blow. The inscription wasn't for Eliza's grandfather, it was a memorial. The ring, Eliza breathed, piecing it together. The ring wasn't for 2 brothers to share, it was for a father and son. Alaric Pierce and his son, William, my grandfather. No, Gideon said, his eyes wide with the horrifying clarity of the truth. Alaric didn't have a son named William in 1922. His son William was born in 1925. In 1922, Alaric Pierce had one child, a son born in 1905, his firstborn son. He clicked one last time, and a black and white photograph filled the screen. It was a formal portrait of two young men, both handsome and proud. One was clearly a young Alaric Pierce. The other, the dreamer, the guardian of the soul, was his brother. Underneath the photograph was the caption, Alaric and Daniel Pierce, 1921. And beneath that, in the official genealogical record, was the final devastating piece of the puzzle. The entry for Daniel Pierce listed his full name, Daniel Owen Pierce. Daniel was the Owen the ring was inscribed for. It wasn't a memorial to his father-in-law. He was reclaiming his middle name, the only part of his identity his brother couldn't take from him. The twist was so profound, so complete, that the room fell silent. The entire family history was a lie. Daniel wasn't the younger brother. Based on his birth year, he was the older brother. He should have been the heir. Alaric was the younger son, the builder. And William Pierce Gideon's grandfather wasn't Alaric's only son. He was the second son. Daniel was Alaric's firstborn. No, wait. Gideon looked at the birth dates again. Daniel born 1905. William born 1925. That couldn't be right. They weren't brothers. Alaric and Daniel were brothers. But William wasn't Daniel's brother. He was his nephew. The story they'd been chasing was wrong. The players were wrong. Eliza's grandfather hadn't met a random outcast. He had met Daniel Owen Pierce, the true disinherited heir to the Pierce fortune. And Daniel hadn't given him a token of solidarity. He had given him the ring, his own ring, inscribed with his own name for safekeeping. It was a piece of evidence, a dormant claim to an empire. And William Pierce Gideon's grandfather hadn't just stolen an invention from Owen Calloway. He had done it to suppress a man who had been in contact with the one person on earth who could challenge his own father's, and therefore his own legitimacy, his uncle Daniel Pierce. The note he knows. Found him. Daniel is the key. Snapped into focus. It was Owen Calloway. Was likely Robert's father or grandfather, another part of the conspiracy. And Daniel was the key because his existence and his connection to Calloway threatened to unravel the foundational lie upon which William Pierce's entire life and fortune were built. They hadn't just silenced an inventor. They were silencing a witness. The truth pieced together from the artisan's ledger was more corrupt than they had ever imagined. Daniel Owen Pierce, the rightful heir, had been systematically erased from history. Gideon's grandfather, William, had silenced Owen Calloway, not over a simple invention, but to bury the foundational lie of their family's power. It became terrifyingly clear that Gideon's cousin Robert knew this dirty secret and was positioning himself to use it as a weapon in a corporate power play. There was only one place to force a reckoning: the annual Pierce Foundation Charity Gala, Robert's personal stage. For Eliza, her mother's presence was non-negotiable. This fight was no longer just about uncovering the truth, it was about delivering justice, and for that to happen, the victim's voice had to be heard. The grand ballroom glittered with false brilliance, a perfect setting for the unmasking. Robert was in his element, the charming, benevolent host. That was until he saw Gideon and Eliza cutting a path directly toward him. His practiced smile became a brittle facade. "Robert," Gideon began, his voice low and cold, cutting through the pleasantries. "The games are over. We know about Daniel Owen Pierce, the true heir." Robert scoffed, preparing a condescending dismissal. "Gideon, you've clearly been listening to fairy tales from a—" He was cut off by a woman's voice, weak but amplified by a microphone that sliced through the ballroom's polite chatter. His fairy tale cost my father his life. A hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to the entrance where Laura Holloway sat in a wheelchair, her gaze locked on Robert with an intensity that defied her frailness. William Pierce destroyed my father because he was friends with the honorable man your family threw away, Laura declared. My father was forced to keep your secret. I will not. As gasps rippled through the stunned crowd, the massive screens on stage meant to display photos of the Foundation's good works flickered. Eliza held up her phone, and the damning image from the Parisian Ledger filled the screens for all to see, the entry detailing the commission for 2 rings, and the name to be inscribed within the second Owen. Trapped, Robert stared from Laura's accusing face to the irrefutable proof on the screens. He was cornered by a ghost from the past and evidence set in stone. Gideon stepped forward, his voice ringing with chilling authority. My family's legacy is built on a lie, he announced to the captive audience. A lie my grandfather silenced a man to protect, and a lie my cousin, he turned pinning Robert with a glare, planned to use for his own personal gain. The public accusation pushed Robert over the edge. His carefully constructed composure shattered into pure, unrestrained rage. You fool, Gideon, he hissed, forgetting the live microphone just inches from his mouth. I was trying to protect us. I knew the truth, and I kept it buried. You and your pathetic little waitress have ruined everything. The confession, amplified for all to hear, echoed in the dead silence of the ballroom. In a single self-incriminating breath, Robert had confirmed a century of corruption and authored his own spectacular downfall. He stood alone, exposed under the glittering chandeliers, the king of a corrupt castle that had just crumbled to dust around him. The aftermath of the gala was a whirlwind of headlines and resignations. The Pierce dynasty was shaken, but in the ensuing quiet, it was being reborn, not broken. Weeks later, in a sun-drenched private hospital suite, a fragile peace had settled. Laura Holloway, looking out over a green garden, had a light in her eyes that Eliza hadn't seen in years. The weight of a lifetime of secrets had finally been lifted. Gideon Pierce entered the room quietly, no longer an untouchable tycoon but a man humbled by the truth. He didn't offer empty apologies. Instead, he placed a leather-bound document on the table beside Laura's bed. The Daniel Owen Pierce Foundation, he said, his voice steady and sincere. It will exist to fund the independent inventors and artists my family tried to crush. A significant portion of my family's fortune will serve as its endowment, with the estate of Owen Calloway as its first honorary beneficiary. Tears welled in Eliza's eyes. It was more than restitution. It was justice forged into a new legacy. Laura simply reached out and placed her hand over Gideon's. You have honored him, she whispered. You have honored them all. Gideon then looked at Eliza, pulling his own phoenix ring from his finger and placing it next to the one that had started it all. The 2 rings, twin flames of pale gold, lay side by side, finally reunited. One for the builder, one for the guardian, he said, his gaze locking with hers. I can rebuild the company, but it has been missing its soul for a century. Help me bring it back, Eliza. It was an offer not of money or power, but of purpose. Looking at the 2 ring symbols of a promise, finally kept Eliza saw a clear path forward. Yes, she said, her voice firm and her heart full. Let's give them a legacy to believe in. A single sentence in a late-night diner set in motion a chain of events that rewrote history. Eliza Holloway, a waitress who fought for her mother's honor, proved that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a power that no fortune can suppress. And Gideon Pierce, a billionaire, trapped in a gilded cage of lies, discovered that true wealth isn't about what you inherit, but about the integrity you choose to build. Their story reminds us that every family has its secrets, and that it sometimes takes the courage of an outsider to bring the truth to light, allowing the phoenix to finally rise from the ashes. If this story of truth, justice, and the incredible power of one person's voice moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates a story that's more than just fiction. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true-to-life dramas that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Click that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thank you for listening.
The millionaire CEO laughed. "If she plays piano, I'll marry her." But when the 22-year-old waitress touched the keys, the entire restaurant froze in disbelief. Follow our channel and hit the like button to support these emotional stories. Your engagement helps us bring more touching moments to life. Now let's dive in. The crystal chandeliers of Le Bernardin cast golden shadows across the marble floors as Alexander Sterling adjusted his Armani suit and surveyed the elegant dining room with the practiced eye of someone who owned half of Manhattan's most exclusive establishments. At 34, he commanded boardrooms with the same ruthless precision he used to dissect a perfectly prepared Dover sole. His dark hair was styled to perfection, his steel-grey eyes calculating every detail of the room, from the imported Italian tablecloths to the worth of each patron's jewelry. "Another champagne, Mr. Sterling?" The sommelier approached with reverent deference, recognizing one of New York's most formidable business titans. Alexander nodded curtly, his attention already shifting to the quarterly reports displayed on his phone screen. Sterling Industries had just closed a $3 billion merger, yet here he sat, obligated to attend his business partner's anniversary dinner when he could be strategizing their next acquisition. "Alexander, you're being antisocial again," chided Victoria Ashworth, sliding into the chair beside him. Her red Valentino dress probably cost more than most people's cars, and her smile held the calculated warmth of someone who'd been raised in Manhattan's social elite. "This is supposed to be a celebration." "I celebrate by making money, Victoria. This," he gestured around the opulent restaurant, "is a waste of time that could be better spent preparing for the Hartwell acquisition." Victoria laughed, a sound like expensive wind chimes. "You know what your problem is. You've forgotten how to have fun. When was the last time you did something spontaneous?" Before Alexander could respond with his usual cutting remark about spontaneity being the enemy of success, a young woman appeared at their table. She moved with quiet grace despite carrying a heavily loaded tray, her long auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that somehow made her green eyes more striking. The black uniform of the restaurant's waitstaff couldn't disguise her natural elegance, though Alexander barely glanced up from his phone. "Good evening. I'm Emma, and I'll be taking care of your table tonight," she said, her voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested exhaustion. "Can I start you with any appetizers?" Victoria ordered, with the casual extravagance of someone who'd never checked a price, while Alexander continued scrolling through emails. When Emma turned to him expectantly, he finally looked up, and for a moment something flickered in his expression, a recognition of intelligence in her eyes that seemed out of place for a waitress in even the finest establishment. "The usual," he said dismissively, returning to his phone. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't know what your usual order is. This is my first evening serving your section." The slight sharpness in her tone made Alexander look up again, this time with the focused attention he usually reserved for boardroom adversaries. There was something in the way she held herself, a dignity that refused to be diminished by his condescension. "Oysters Rockefeller, the Wagyu beef, medium rare and whatever wine pairs best," he said, his voice carrying the impatience of someone unaccustomed to repeating himself. "Excellent choice." "The 2015 Bordeaux would complement the Wagyu beautifully," Emma replied, and Alexander caught the subtle note of knowledge in her recommendation, knowledge that went beyond standard server training. As she walked away, Victoria leaned closer. "She's pretty." "She's the help," Alexander replied, though his eyes followed Emma's retreating figure longer than he cared to admit. The evening progressed with typical Manhattan social theater, discussions of real estate prices, complaints about the mayor's policies, and gossip about which socialite was divorcing which hedge fund prince. Alexander participated with half his attention, while the other half remained fixed on quarterly projections, until Victoria suddenly grabbed his arm. "Oh my God, Alexander, look!" She pointed toward the restaurant's grand piano, where the evening's scheduled pianist, a distinguished older gentleman, was being helped to a chair by concerned staff members. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the maitre d', his French accent thick with concern, "I'm afraid Monsieur Dubois has taken ill and will be unable to perform this evening. We sincerely apologize for any disappointment." A murmur of disappointment rippled through the dining room. The piano was a centerpiece of Le Bernardin's ambiance, its nightly performances as essential as the expertly prepared cuisine. Alexander saw an opportunity for entertainment in the disruption. The champagne had loosened his tongue, and Victoria's earlier comment about spontaneity had touched a nerve. He stood commanding attention with the natural authority that came from owning buildings taller than most people's ambitions. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried easily across the restaurant, "I have a proposition that might salvage our evening's entertainment." All eyes turned to him, including Emma's, who had been clearing a nearby table. Alexander's gaze found hers and held it, a predatory smile spreading across his handsome features. "I'll bet anyone in this room that our charming waitress here," he gestured toward Emma, who had gone completely still, "can't play a single piece on that piano with any degree of competence. In fact, I'm so confident in this assessment that I'll make an outrageous wager." The restaurant had fallen completely silent, the kind of silence that precedes either triumph or disaster. Emma's face had gone pale, but her green eyes blazed with something that might have been fury or determination. "What kind of wager, Mr. Sterling?" The use of his name surprised him. She'd been listening, learning, cataloging information like any good intelligence gatherer. "Interesting. If you can play any classical piece with the skill of a trained musician, really play, not just stumble through chopsticks, I'll marry you." The words came out before his rational mind could stop them, fueled by champagne and the absolute certainty that a waitress couldn't possibly possess such skills. Victoria gasped. "Alexander, you can't be serious." "Dead serious," he replied, his eyes never leaving Emma's face. "Of course, when you inevitably fail, you'll quit this job tonight and never work in any establishment I frequent again. Fair enough?" The cruelty of the wager wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Alexander Sterling could destroy a service worker's career in Manhattan with a single phone call, and everyone knew it. This wasn't just a bet, it was a public humiliation designed to amuse a bored billionaire. Emma stood perfectly still for a long moment, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet strength that made Alexander's smug confidence waver almost imperceptibly. "And if I win, you'll honor your word? You'll actually marry me?" "I'm a man of my word in business," Alexander replied, though something in Emma's tone made him suddenly wish he'd ordered another bottle of wine instead of making foolish bets. Emma walked toward the piano with measured steps, her posture straightening with each stride. As she passed tables of Manhattan's elite, whispers followed in her wake. Some diners had their phones out, recording what they assumed would be either spectacular failure or social media gold. She sat at the bench, her fingers hovering over the keys for a moment that stretched into eternity. When she finally placed her hands on the keyboard, something extraordinary happened. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the restaurant with crystalline perfection. Not the simple melody, but the full, complex arrangement that required years of classical training to master. Emma's fingers moved across the keys with fluid precision, her entire body swaying with the music, as if she and the piano were old lovers reunited after a long separation. The technical difficulty of the piece was staggering: rapid scales, complex harmonies, and emotional passages that required not just skill but deep musical understanding. Emma played it flawlessly, her face transformed by concentration and something deeper, something that looked like pain being channeled into beauty. Alexander's smug smile had vanished completely. His champagne glass hung forgotten in his hand as he watched this waitress, this woman he'd dismissed as the help, perform with the skill of a conservatory graduate. Around the restaurant, conversations had stopped entirely. Even the kitchen staff had emerged to listen. When Emma reached the concerto's most technically challenging passage, a section that separated amateur pianists from true artists, she didn't just survive it, she soared. Her left hand maintained the complex bass line, while her right hand danced through intricate melodies with a precision that would have impressed Carnegie Hall audiences. The final notes lingered in the air like a blessing, and for several heartbeats no one moved. Then applause erupted, genuine and thunderous, from every corner of the restaurant. Several women were crying, and even the hardened maitre d' was wiping his eyes. Emma stood slowly, her hands shaking now from more than just nerves. She looked directly at Alexander, and in her eyes he saw something that made his chest tight. Not triumph, but a profound sadness, mixed with steely determination. "I believe you owe me a wedding, Mr. Sterling." Alexander Sterling had built his empire by never showing weakness. But as he stared at Emma across the now silent restaurant, he felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. Complete uncertainty. The woman standing by the piano wasn't the simple waitress he'd mockingly challenged. The skill she'd just demonstrated represented years of elite musical training, the kind that cost more than most people's annual salaries. "That was," Victoria whispered beside him, but her words trailed off as she processed the implications of what they'd all witnessed. Alexander's business instincts kicked in, searching for an escape clause, a technicality that could void his impulsive wager. But he'd made the bet publicly, in front of Manhattan's social elite, many of whom were already recording the aftermath on their phones. His reputation for being a man of his word in business deals was the foundation of his success. He couldn't simply walk away from this without destroying his credibility. Emma began walking back toward their table, her movements controlled but graceful. As she approached, Alexander noticed details he'd missed before. The way she carried herself with natural poise despite wearing a server's uniform, the intelligence in her green eyes that suggested depths he hadn't bothered to explore, and something else, a wariness that spoke of experience with disappointment. "Well," she said quietly when she reached his table, "are you a man of your word, or just another rich man who thinks promises are for other people?" The challenge in her voice sparked something competitive in Alexander's nature. He stood, matching her height in her comfortable flats to his expensive Italian shoes. "I made a public wager, and you've fulfilled your end admirably. But surely you don't expect me to actually marry someone I've known for all of 30 minutes. I expect you to honor your commitment, Mr. Sterling. You made the terms quite clear. If I could play classical music with the skill of a trained musician, you'd marry me." "I held up my end of the bargain," Victoria gasped. "Emma, you can't be serious. You don't actually want to marry him." Emma's smile held no warmth. "Oh, but I am serious. Deadly serious." Alexander studied her face, looking for signs of gold-digger desperation or social climbing ambition. Instead, he found something far more complex. Determination mixed with what looked suspiciously like hurt pride and carefully controlled anger. "You're calling in the debt?" he asked, his voice dropping to the low tone he used in hostile business negotiations. "I'm collecting on a promise. There's a difference." The surrounding diners were still watching, phones still recording, social media posts already being crafted about the most outrageous bet in Manhattan's social history. Alexander realized he was trapped by his own arrogance and the very public nature of his foolish wager. "Fine," he said, his jaw tight, "but we'll do this properly. A real engagement, a proper wedding. If I'm going to honor this ridiculous bet, we'll do it right." Emma's composure flickered for just a moment, as if she hadn't expected him to actually agree. "How properly?" 6 months engagement minimum. You'll move into my penthouse. We'll attend social functions together. And you'll learn what it means to be married to someone in my position. If after 6 months you still want to go through with this insanity, we'll have a wedding that won't embarrass either of us. And if I change my mind during those 6 months, Alexander's smile was sharp, then you walk away with nothing, having proven that this was just an elaborate gold-digger scheme. The insult hit its mark. Emma's cheeks flushed with anger. "I'm not a gold-digger, Mr. Sterling. I'm a woman who believes people should keep their promises." "We'll see," he replied coolly. Then louder for the benefit of their audience, "Ladies and gentlemen, it appears I'm engaged." The restaurant erupted in surprised chatter and congratulations that ranged from genuine to clearly fake. Victoria looked stunned, while Emma appeared to be questioning her own sanity. As the evening wound down and other diners began to leave, many stopping to congratulate the unlikely couple, Alexander found himself alone with Emma by the piano. The restaurant staff was giving them space, though he caught them whispering and stealing glances. "So," he said, adjusting his cufflinks in a gesture that betrayed his nervousness, "I suppose we should discuss practical arrangements. Do you have somewhere to live currently?" "A small apartment in Queens," Emma replied, her voice careful and neutral. "You'll need to give notice immediately. I'll have my assistant arrange for your belongings to be moved to my penthouse. We'll need to shop for appropriate clothing. My fiancé can't be seen in." He gestured vaguely at her server's uniform. Emma's eyes flashed dangerously. "There's nothing wrong with honest work, Mr. Sterling. And there's nothing wrong with my clothes outside of this uniform." "Of course not," he said quickly, recognizing he'd stumbled into dangerous territory. "I simply meant that as my fiancé, you'll be attending events that have certain expectations about attire. Designer gowns and jewelry worth more than some people's houses?" "Exactly." Emma was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. "Can I ask you something?" "What? Why did you make that bet? Really? Was it just cruelty for entertainment, or was there something else?" The question caught Alexander off guard with its directness. He found himself actually considering it seriously, instead of deflecting with his usual sarcasm. "Honestly, you intrigued me," he admitted. "There was something about the way you carried yourself, the way you recommended that wine. You didn't seem like just a waitress, but I couldn't figure out what you were hiding. The bet was crude curiosity, I suppose." "And what do you think now that you know I can play piano?" Alexander looked at her carefully. "Now I think you're hiding much more than I initially suspected. The question is whether that makes you more interesting or more dangerous." Emma's laugh held no humor. "I suppose you'll find out during our 6-month engagement, won't you?" "I suppose I will." He paused, then asked, "Where did you learn to play like that?" That wasn't amateur hour talent. For the first time since the bet began, Emma's composure cracked slightly. Pain flashed across her features before she controlled it. "That's a story for another day, Mr. Sterling." "Alexander," he corrected automatically. "If we're going to be engaged, you should use my first name." "Alexander," she repeated, and something about the way she said it made his name sound different, more personal. "And you should know I'm not doing this for your money. I have my own reasons for accepting this arrangement." "What reasons?" Emma gathered her purse and the light jacket she'd worn to work. "Like I said, that's a story for another day. But Alexander, you might want to have your assistant research the name Emma Blackwood before I move into your penthouse." She walked away, leaving Alexander standing by the piano with the distinct feeling that he'd just agreed to far more than a simple business arrangement. The name Blackwood tickled something in his memory, but he couldn't quite place it. As he watched Emma disappear into the Manhattan night, Alexander Sterling, who had never met a challenge he couldn't conquer or a problem he couldn't solve with money, realized he might have finally bitten off more than he could chew, and for the first time in years he found himself genuinely curious about what tomorrow would bring. Alexander's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of Sterling Tower, a testament to both his success and his need to remain above the city he'd conquered. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Manhattan, while the interior design spoke of refined taste and unlimited budgets. As he waited for Emma to arrive with her belongings, he found himself unusually restless. His assistant, Margaret Chen, had delivered the research he'd requested on Emma Blackwood with her typical efficiency, but the file she'd placed on his mahogany desk remained unopened. Some instinct told him he should hear Emma's story from her own lips, rather than read it in a cold investigative report. The elevator chimed, and Emma stepped into his private foyer, carrying 2 modest suitcases and a worn leather messenger bag. She'd traded her server's uniform for dark jeans and a cream silk blouse that suggested she owned better clothes than he'd assumed. Her auburn hair fell loose around her shoulders, and without the harsh restaurant lighting, he could see that she was even more beautiful than he'd initially realized. Impressive, she said, looking around the space with an appraising eye that suggested familiarity with luxury, rather than awe at experiencing it for the first time. You don't seem surprised by the accommodations, Alexander observed. I'm not, Emma replied simply, setting down her luggage. I've seen places like this before. Another puzzle piece that didn't quite fit the Waitress narrative. Alexander filed the information away and gestured toward the hallway. The guest suite is down the hall. You'll have your own bathroom, walk-in closet and sitting area, complete privacy. Emma nodded. And what exactly do you expect from me during these 6 months? Public appearances as my fiancé. Social events, business dinners, charity galas. You'll need to be convincing in the role. My reputation depends on this looking legitimate. And privately? Alexander met her gaze directly. Privately, we're strangers who made a foolish bet. I won't pretend this is some romantic fairy tale, and I assume you're too intelligent to expect one. Emma's smile was enigmatic. You assume a great deal about what I expect, Alexander. She moved to the window, looking out over the city with an expression he couldn't read. In profile, with the afternoon light catching her features, she looked almost aristocratic, the kind of bone structure that suggested generations of breeding and privilege. Can I ask you something? She said without turning around. What? Do you remember the Blackwood Industries collapse 8 years ago? The name hit Alexander like a physical blow. Suddenly he knew exactly why Blackwood had seemed familiar. The scandal had been front-page news for months, a family empire built over 4 generations, destroyed overnight by embezzlement charges and fraudulent accounting. The family had lost everything. Their fortune, their social standing, their reputation. You're not, he began, but Emma turned to face him, and her expression confirmed his suspicion. Emma Blackwood, former heiress to a $2 billion fortune, former member of New York's social elite, former student at Juilliard, where I was studying piano performance before my world imploded. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the pain underneath. Current waitress, former cleaning lady, former nanny, former whatever job I could get to survive. Alexander stared at her, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. Your father was Jonathan Blackwood, the embezzlement scandal. My father was framed, Emma said quietly, by his business partner and best friend, who needed a scapegoat when their offshore accounts were discovered by federal investigators. But by the time the truth came out, Dad was already dead from a heart attack brought on by the stress and humiliation. The family name was destroyed, the money was gone, and I was 22 years old with a music degree and no practical skills for survival in the real world. The raw honesty in her voice made Alexander feel something unfamiliar, shame at his earlier dismissiveness, and something deeper that might have been respect. Why didn't you tell me this at the restaurant? Emma laughed bitterly. And what would you have done? Probably offered me money out of pity and rescinded your bet. I didn't want your charity, Alexander. I wanted your pride to cost you something, the way it cost my family everything. So this is revenge. This is justice, Emma corrected. You made a bet designed to humiliate someone you saw as beneath you. Instead, you're going to learn what it's like to be bound by a commitment you can't buy your way out of. Alexander walked to his bar and poured himself a scotch, his mind racing. Emma Blackwood, he remembered her now from society pages, back when she'd been a promising young pianist and a fixture at Manhattan charity events. The transformation from privileged socialite to service worker must have been devastating. The piano skills, he said, understanding flooding through him. 12 years of training at the finest conservatories money could buy. I was scheduled to perform with the New York Philharmonic the month after my world collapsed. Instead, I spent that month learning how to clean office buildings for minimum wage. Alexander downed his scotch, the burn helping him process this revelation. Why take the bet, Emma? You could have just let me make a fool of myself and walked away. Emma moved closer, and he could smell her perfume. Something subtle and expensive that suggested old money rather than new wealth. Because I've spent 8 years being invisible, being dismissed, being treated as less than human by people who used to bow and scrape for my family's approval. Last night you looked at me the way they all do, as if I was nothing, and I realized I was tired of being nothing. So you decided to become my fiancé. I decided to remind a certain arrogant CEO that actions have consequences, even for men who think they're untouchable. Alexander found himself oddly impressed by her strategic thinking. And what happens in 6 months when this engagement is supposed to end? What's your exit strategy? Emma's smile was mysterious. Who says I have one? The implications of that statement hung in the air between them. Alexander studied her face, looking for signs of gold-digger opportunism, but instead found something more complex: intelligence, determination, and what might have been genuine attraction beneath the calculated strategy. You're playing a dangerous game, Emma Blackwood. I learned from the best, she replied. 8 years in the service industry teaches you how to hold people, how to anticipate their moves, how to survive in a world that wants to crush you. You may have built an empire, Alexander, but I've learned how to rise from the ashes of one. Alexander set down his empty glass, his business instincts warring with something else, and growing fascination with this woman who had turned his simple, cruel bet into something far more complex. All right, he said finally. 6 months. But Emma, if you think you can play me the way those society vultures played your father, you're going to be disappointed. I didn't build Sterling Industries by being naive about people's motivations. Emma's laugh was genuinely amused this time. Oh, Alexander, if you think this is about money, you really don't understand what game we're playing. As she picked up her luggage and headed toward the guest suite, Alexander found himself watching her with new eyes. Emma Blackwood wasn't just beautiful or talented or mysterious. She was dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with physical threat, and everything to do with the growing certainty that his carefully controlled life was about to become very, very complicated. And despite every rational instinct screaming warnings, he found himself looking forward to finding out exactly how complicated things were about to become. 3 weeks into their engagement, Alexander Sterling discovered that living with Emma Blackwood was like trying to contain lightning in a bottle. She moved through his penthouse with the unconscious grace of someone born to luxury, yet her sharp observations about his business dealings revealed an intelligence that constantly surprised him. What disturbed him most was how naturally she fit into his world, and how much he'd begun to look forward to their evening conversations over dinner. That illusion of harmony shattered on a cold Tuesday morning when Margaret Chen knocked on his office door with an expression that meant trouble. "Sir, there's a situation developing. Richard Hartwell is here with his legal team, and they're demanding an immediate meeting. They seem agitated." Alexander looked up from the merger documents spread across his desk. The Hartwell acquisition was the crown jewel of Sterling Industries' expansion plan, worth $4 billion and 18 months of careful negotiation. Richard Hartwell was old-money Manhattan aristocracy, the kind of man who viewed business as a gentleman's game with unwritten rules. "Send them in." Richard Hartwell entered with 2 lawyers flanking him like bodyguards. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his Savile Row suit impeccable, but his usually composed demeanor showed cracks of barely controlled fury. "Alexander," he said without preamble, "we need to discuss your recent romantic entanglement." Alexander's blood chilled. "I'm not sure what you mean, Richard. Don't insult my intelligence." Hartwell dropped a manila folder on the desk. "Emma Blackwood, the fallen heiress you're parading around as your fiancée. Did you really think I wouldn't investigate the woman who's suddenly appeared in your life just as we're finalizing the largest merger in both our companies' histories?" Alexander opened the folder with steady hands, though his pulse was racing. Inside were photographs of Emma at charity events from 8 years ago, newspaper clippings about the Blackwood family scandal, and recent paparazzi shots of her and Alexander at a gallery opening the previous week. "This is irrelevant to our business dealings," Alexander said carefully. Hartwell's laugh was cold. "Irrelevant? Alexander, I'm about to merge my family's century-old company with yours. That requires absolute trust, complete confidence in your judgment, and you've just proven that your judgment is catastrophically compromised." "How exactly have I done that?" "By allowing yourself to be seduced by a gold digger with revenge fantasies. Do you have any idea what Emma Blackwood's real agenda might be? Her father's business partner, the man who supposedly framed Jonathan Blackwood, was my cousin David Hartwell." Alexander felt the floor drop out from under him. David Hartwell had been found dead in his Swiss chalet 2 years ago, an apparent suicide after years of guilt over the Blackwood scandal. The case had been closed with his death, all questions answered, all blame assigned. "I see you're beginning to understand," Richard continued ruthlessly. "Emma Blackwood has every reason to hate my family, and by extension anyone associated with us. What better way to destroy the Hartwell-Sterling merger than to seduce you into a compromising position?" Alexander's mind raced through every conversation he'd had with Emma, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. But all he could remember was her honesty about her past, her dignity in the face of his initial cruelty, and the growing warmth in her eyes when she looked at him. "You're suggesting she orchestrated our meeting at the restaurant. I'm suggesting she's been planning revenge for 8 years, and you've walked directly into her trap." Hartwell leaned forward. "Alexander, I've known you since you were a boy. Your father and I were friends for 40 years. Don't let a beautiful woman with a sob story destroy everything you've built." The door to Alexander's office opened, and Emma appeared, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of casual elegance that made his chest tight every morning. She stopped when she saw the gathering, her eyes quickly assessing the tension in the room. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were in a meeting," she said, but her gaze had already found the photographs scattered across Alexander's desk. Richard Hartwell stood, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "Miss Blackwood, how lovely to finally meet you properly. Though I believe we've met before, at several charity events back when your family was still relevant." Emma's composure didn't crack, but Alexander saw her hands tighten on the coffee cups. "Mr. Hartwell, I remember you from those events. You always spoke so fondly of your cousin David." The name hung in the air like poison. Alexander watched Emma's face, looking for any sign that Hartwell's accusations might be true, but her expression remained carefully neutral. "David was troubled by what happened to your family," Hartwell said. "The guilt ate at him until it killed him." "Guilt is a powerful emotion," Emma agreed quietly. "It can drive people to desperate actions." Alexander couldn't read the undercurrents flowing between them, but the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. Something was happening here that went far deeper than business concerns or romantic skepticism. "Emma," Alexander said slowly, "perhaps you could give us some privacy to finish our meeting." She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something die in her eyes, a trust or hope that had been growing between them over the past 3 weeks. "Of course," she said. "I understand completely." After she left, Hartwell turned back to Alexander with grim satisfaction. "You see how she manipulates situations? How she positions herself as the victim while inserting herself into private business discussions. She brought me coffee, Richard. That's hardly industrial espionage." "It's surveillance, Alexander. She's gathering intelligence on our merger, probably planning to sabotage it at the worst possible moment." Hartwell gathered the photographs. "I'm giving you a choice. End this engagement immediately, publicly and definitively, or the Hartwell-Sterling merger is dead. I won't risk 4 generations of my family's legacy on your romantic delusions." Alexander stared at the older man, feeling the walls of his carefully constructed world closing in. The merger wasn't just business. It was his legacy, his proof that he'd surpassed even his father's achievements. Without it, Sterling Industries would remain successful, but never legendary. "How long do I have to decide?" 24 hours. "But Alexander, if you choose her over this deal, you'll be making the biggest mistake of your life. And unlike romantic disappointments, business mistakes like this don't heal with time." After Hartwell left, Alexander sat alone in his office, staring at the city spread out below his windows. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built, was balanced on the edge of a knife. On one side lay the business deal that would cement his place among Manhattan's most powerful men. On the other side lay a woman who had walked into his life through a cruel bet and somehow become. What? What was Emma to him, really? That evening, Alexander found Emma on the penthouse terrace, looking out over the city lights. She'd changed into a simple black dress that somehow made her look more elegant than any of the designer gowns he'd bought her. "You're going to choose the merger," she said without turning around. Alexander joined her at the railing, maintaining careful distance between them. It's what makes sense from a business perspective. Of course it does. Emma's voice held no anger, only a tired resignation. Richard Hartwell made his case quite convincingly, I'm sure. He thinks you're using me to get revenge on his family. Emma turned to face him then, and Alexander was shocked to see tears in her eyes, the first real emotional vulnerability she'd shown since moving into his home. And what do you think, Alexander? He wanted to tell her that he thought Hartwell was a paranoid old man clinging to outdated prejudices. He wanted to say that the past 3 weeks had shown him a woman of intelligence, dignity, and unexpected humor. He wanted to admit that somewhere between her piano performance and her quiet strength, he'd begun to fall in love with her. Instead, he heard himself say, "I think I can't afford to find out," or to... Emma nodded slowly, as if she'd expected exactly that answer. "I'll be out of your penthouse by tomorrow evening. You can announce that our engagement was a mistake, that you've come to your senses. Your precious merger will be safe." She started to walk past him toward the door, but Alexander caught her arm. "Emma, wait. I need to ask you directly. Is Hartwell right? Are you here for revenge?" Emma looked down at his hand on her arm, then back to his face. "Alexander, if I told you the truth about why I'm really here, would you believe me? Or would you assume I was lying to protect my position?" The question hung between them, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Alexander released her arm, and Emma disappeared into the penthouse, leaving him alone with the city lights and the growing certainty that he was about to make a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Later that night, as Alexander lay awake staring at the ceiling, he heard the sound of piano music drifting through the penthouse. Emma was playing something he didn't recognize, a mournful, beautiful piece that seemed to capture all the sadness of dreams dying and chances lost forever. By morning, the music had stopped, and Alexander Sterling began preparing to choose his empire over his heart. Alexander's sleep was shattered at 3 a.m. by the insistent buzzing of his phone. Margaret's name appeared on the screen, and his assistant never called at this hour unless the world was ending. "Sir," Margaret's voice was tight with urgency, "you need to see the morning news, all channels, now." Alexander stumbled to his living room and turned on the television, flipping through channels until he found the breaking news report. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. Shocking revelation about the Blackwood Industries scandal that rocked Manhattan 8 years ago, the CNN anchor was saying. New evidence has surfaced, proving that Jonathan Blackwood was indeed framed by his business partner, David Hartwell, in an elaborate scheme to hide massive embezzlement and securities fraud. Alexander's legs gave out, and he collapsed onto his sofa as the report continued. The evidence was discovered in a safety deposit box registered to David Hartwell, accessed only after his death 2 years ago by Swiss authorities investigating international money laundering. The box contained signed confessions, forged documents, and recorded conversations proving that Hartwell orchestrated the entire scheme to frame his partner when federal investigators got too close to their offshore accounts. The screen filled with documents, David Hartwell's handwriting confessing to years of embezzlement, detailed plans for framing Jonathan Blackwood, and most damning of all, recordings of Hartwell laughing about destroying that naive fool Jonathan while transferring millions to hidden accounts. Alexander's phone rang. Richard Hartwell's name appeared on the screen, but Alexander let it go to voicemail. He was too stunned to speak, too horrified by the implications of what he was seeing. The news anchor continued. Perhaps most heartbreaking is this final recording, made just days before David Hartwell's suicide, where he expresses remorse for destroying an innocent family. David Hartwell's voice, thick with guilt and alcohol, filled Alexander's living room. "Jonathan Blackwood was the most honest man I ever knew. He trusted me like a brother, and I destroyed him to save my own skin. His daughter, Emma. God, she was just a kid with dreams of being a concert pianist. What did I do to them? What did I do?" Alexander's phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret. "Sir, Richard Hartwell just issued a statement withdrawing from the merger indefinitely. He's claiming he needs time to process his family's tragic scandal. The financial press is calling it the collapse of the decade." But Alexander barely registered the business implications. All he could think about was Emma's face when he'd chosen the merger over believing in her. Emma, who had been telling the truth all along. Emma, whose family had been destroyed by the very people Alexander had chosen to trust over her. He found her in the guest suite, packing the same 2 modest suitcases she'd arrived with 3 weeks earlier. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and her expression was calm. Too calm, the kind of composure that came from years of practice at surviving devastating disappointment. "I suppose you've seen the news," she said quietly, folding a silk blouse with careful precision. "Emma, Alexander stopped, realizing that no words could adequately express his shame and regret. "I'm sorry, I'm so incredibly sorry." "Are you?" Emma continued packing, not looking at him. "Or are you just sorry that your business deal fell through anyway?" The question hit him like a physical blow because part of him wasn't sure of the answer. "I should have believed you. I should have trusted you over Hartwell." "Yes, you should have." Emma closed one suitcase and started on the second. "But you didn't, and that tells me everything I need to know about what I mean to you versus what your business empire means to you." Alexander stepped into the room, desperate to make her understand. "Emma, please, give me another chance. Let me prove that I can choose you over everything else." Emma's laugh was bitter. "Alexander, you had your chance to choose me. You had your chance to believe in me, to trust me, to see me as more than just a potential threat to your precious deals. And you failed. People make mistakes, Emma. People learn from their mistakes." "Some mistakes can't be undone." Emma straightened, meeting his eyes directly. "Do you know what the worst part of this is? It's not that you chose business over me. I expected that from a man like you. The worst part is that for 3 weeks I actually believed you were different. I thought maybe, just maybe, you were falling in love with me the way I was falling in love with you." The admission hung in the air between them, more devastating than any accusation. Alexander felt something crack inside his chest at the realization that he'd had something precious and rare, and he'd thrown it away for a business deal that had crumbled anyway. "You were falling in love with me?" he asked quietly. Emma's composure finally broke, tears spilling down her cheeks. "God help me, yes. Despite everything, your arrogance, your cruelty at that restaurant, your assumption that I was beneath you, I was falling in love with the man I saw in quiet moments. The man who asked thoughtful questions about my music, who listened when I talked about my dreams, who made me feel like maybe I could trust someone again." Alexander moved closer, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. "Emma, I was falling in love with you too. I am in love with you. That's why this is so hard. That's why I'm terrified of losing you. But not terrified enough to choose me when it mattered." The simple truth of it was unbearable. Alexander had spent his entire adult life making calculated decisions, weighing risks and benefits, never letting emotions cloud his judgment. But with Emma, he'd let fear override his heart when his heart was finally telling him something important. "What can I do?" he asked desperately. "How can I fix this?" Emma wiped her tears and picked up her suitcases. "You can let me go, Alexander. You can let me walk out of here with whatever dignity I have left, and you can go back to your empire building and your mergers and your safe, calculated life. I don't want that life without you in it." "Then you should have thought of that yesterday when you chose Richard Hartwell's word over mine." Emma walked toward the door, but Alexander blocked her path. "Please, just tell me what you want. Tell me how to make this right." Emma looked at him for a long moment, and Alexander saw 8 years of pain and disappointment in her green eyes. "I want you to mean it when you say you love me. I want you to choose me not because it's convenient or because your business deal fell through anyway, but because you genuinely believe I'm worth more than any deal, any merger, any amount of money. You are worth more than any of that. Prove it." "How?" Emma smiled sadly. "That's something you'll have to figure out yourself, Alexander. Grand gestures are easy when you have unlimited money. But real love, real trust, real commitment, those require something you've never been willing to give anyone." "What's that?" "Faith. Faith in another person without guarantees, without safety nets, without assurance of profit or return on investment." Emma stepped around him toward the door. "When you're ready to love someone with that kind of faith, call me. Until then, goodbye." She was gone before he could respond, leaving only the faint scent of her perfume and the echo of devastating truth in her words. Alexander stood in the empty guest suite, surrounded by the wreckage of the best thing that had ever happened to him, and realized that for all his business acumen, he'd never learned the most important lesson of all. Some gambles were worth taking, not because you were guaranteed to win, but because losing them would cost you everything that really mattered. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander Sterling understood what it meant to feel truly poor. Outside his windows, Manhattan sparkled in the early morning light, but Alexander barely noticed. He was too busy figuring out how to prove to the woman he loved that she was worth more than his entire empire, and wondering if he was brave enough to actually do it. 2 months after Emma left, Alexander Sterling had systematically dismantled every assumption about himself that he'd built over 34 years. The revelation of David Hartwell's guilt had done more than vindicate Emma's family. It had forced Alexander to confront the uncomfortable truth that he'd inherited his father's prejudices along with his business empire. He'd spent weeks in therapy, learning to recognize the difference between calculating risks and refusing to be vulnerable. He'd restructured Sterling Industries to prioritize ethical practices over maximum profit. And most importantly, he'd begun the painstaking process of locating every person who had suffered when the Blackwood family fell, quietly making financial amends without fanfare or credit. But none of that mattered if he couldn't find Emma. She'd vanished from New York as completely as if she'd never existed. Her Queens apartment had been vacated, her former co-workers at the restaurant had no forwarding address, and even his most skilled private investigators had come up empty. Emma Blackwood had learned how to disappear from 8 years of survival in the shadows of society. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret Chen knocked on his office door on a rainy Thursday evening with an expression that suggested good news for the first time in months. "Sir, I found her." Alexander's heart stopped. "Where?" "Boston. She's been working as a piano instructor at the New England Conservatory, using her maiden name and teaching under a program for underprivileged children." Margaret handed him a file. "She's also been living in a small apartment near the school and apparently playing weekend gigs at a jazz club in Cambridge." Alexander stared at the address, his hands trembling slightly. "How long has she been there?" "Since about a week after she left New York. Sir, there's something else. I made some discreet inquiries, and it appears she's been donating most of her salary to a scholarship fund for children whose families have faced financial disasters. She's calling it the Jonathan Blackwood Memorial Fund." The information hit Alexander like a physical blow. While he'd been wallowing in self-pity and business restructuring, Emma had been quietly building something beautiful from the ashes of her own tragedy. "Margaret, I need you to charter a flight to Boston tonight." "Sir, it's nearly 10 p.m. "Tonight, Margaret, and call the conservatory's dean. I want to make a donation. A large one." The New England Conservatory was a beautifully preserved building that spoke of musical traditions stretching back generations. Alexander arrived at noon the next day, his heart hammering as he followed the sound of piano music through elegantly appointed hallways. He found Emma in a small practice room, working with a boy who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Through the glass door, Alexander watched her demonstrate a passage with the same fluid grace he remembered, her face animated with the joy of teaching. She was wearing a simple navy dress and had cut her hair shorter, just to her shoulders, but she was every bit as beautiful as his memory had insisted during the long nights without her. More beautiful, actually, because she looked genuinely happy for the first time since he'd known her. When the lesson ended and the young student left, Alexander knocked softly on the door. Emma looked up, and the blood drained from her face when she saw him. "Hello, Emma." "Alexander." She stood slowly, her hands smoothing her dress in a nervous gesture he remembered. "What are you doing here?" "Learning to take the kind of gamble that has nothing to do with business profit." Emma's eyes were guarded, but he caught a flicker of something that might have been hope. "What does that mean?" Alexander stepped into the practice room, close enough to smell her familiar perfume, but careful not to invade her space. "It means I've spent the last 2 months figuring out the difference between wanting something and deserving it. It means I've been in therapy, learning why I was so terrified of trusting you that I chose to trust Richard Hartwell instead." "And what did you learn?" That I spent my whole life building walls to protect myself from exactly what you were offering me. Real intimacy, real trust, real love without conditions or contracts. Alexander took a shaky breath. I learned that I was a coward who was more afraid of being vulnerable than I was committed to being worthy of you. Emma was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. Those are important lessons, Alexander. I'm glad you learned them. But learning them doesn't automatically make everything okay between us. Alexander nodded. I know. That's why I'm here to prove that I've changed, not just promise that I have. How do you plan to do that? Alexander reached into his jacket and pulled out a legal document. By doing something that goes against every business instinct I've ever had. Emma took the document, her eyes widening as she read. This is a transfer of 50% of Sterling Industries to the Jonathan Blackwood Memorial Foundation, with you as the sole trustee, empowered to direct how those profits are used. No oversight from me, no conditions, no strings attached. Alexander's voice was steady despite his racing heart. Half my empire, given freely to you to use as you see fit. Emma stared at the document, then at him. Alexander, this is hundreds of millions of dollars. It's proof that I value you more than money. It's proof that I trust you completely, without guarantee of return on investment. It's proof that I choose you over everything else, even when, especially when, I have no idea whether you'll choose me back. Emma set the document on the piano bench with trembling hands. You can't just throw money at this problem, Alexander. I'm not throwing money at the problem. I'm giving you the power to fix problems for thousands of other people, the way I should have had the power to fix your family's problems 8 years ago if I'd been paying attention to anything besides profit margins. Emma's eyes filled with tears. And what do you want in return? Nothing, Alexander said simply. If you take that money and use it to help people and never speak to me again, I'll consider it the best investment I ever made. If you take it and give me a chance to prove I can love you the way you deserve to be loved, I'll consider myself the luckiest man alive. Emma turned to look out the practice room window at the students crossing the courtyard below. You know what the hardest part of loving you was? What? Knowing that you had the capacity to be everything I needed, but watching you choose to be less than that because it felt safer. She faced him again. You broke my heart, Alexander. Not because you chose your business over me, but because you chose fear over love. I know, and I'm sorry. Not just sorry that it happened, but sorry that I was the kind of man who let it happen. Emma wiped her eyes. The man I fell in love with, the one I saw in quiet moments, would never have made the choice you made that night. Then let me prove I can be that man consistently, not just in quiet moments. Alexander stepped closer. Emma, I love you. Not because you're beautiful, or talented, or intriguing, but because you make me want to be better than I am. You make me want to deserve the kind of love you're capable of giving. And how do I know you won't get scared again when things get difficult? Alexander smiled, and Emma was startled to see that it was different from his old smiles, warmer, more genuine, less calculated. Because I'm more scared of losing you than I am of being vulnerable with you. Because I've learned that the biggest risk isn't opening my heart, it's keeping it closed and missing out on the kind of love that makes everything else meaningless. Emma stared at him for a long moment, and Alexander held his breath, waiting for her verdict. The scholarship fund, she said quietly. What about it? I want to expand it. Not just for families facing financial disaster, but for any child who shows musical promise but can't afford training. I want to create a network of programs across the country. Alexander's heart began to race. That sounds like an incredible use of resources. It would take years to build. I'd need someone I could trust completely to help manage the business side while I focused on the educational programs. I can think of someone who might be qualified for that position. Emma's smile was small but genuine. Can you? Someone with business experience but also a commitment to putting people before profits. Someone who's learned that the most important skill in business is knowing when not to be businesslike. Emma laughed, and the sound was like music to Alexander's ears. And what would this person want in return for such a commitment? The chance to wake up every morning next to the woman he loves. The opportunity to build something meaningful together, instead of just building an empire. Maybe a lifetime of piano concerts in the evenings and quiet conversations over dinner. Emma stepped closer, close enough that Alexander could see gold flecks in her green eyes. That sounds like a significant long-term investment. The best investments always are. And you're prepared to make that kind of commitment, without guarantees, without certainty of success. Alexander reached up to touch her face gently. Emma Blackwood, I'm prepared to love you with the kind of faith that doesn't require guarantees. I'm prepared to choose you every day, in every situation for the rest of my life. I'm prepared to be the man you saw in me before I was brave enough to see him in myself. Emma leaned into his touch, and Alexander felt his world shift back into focus for the first time in 2 months. Alexander Sterling, are you asking me to marry you? For real this time? I'm asking you to let me spend my life proving that some gambles are worth taking, not because you're guaranteed to win, but because losing them would cost you everything that matters. Emma's kiss was her answer, sweet and certain, and full of the promise of second chances and hard-won wisdom. When they broke apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. So, Emma said, wiping his tears with her thumb, I suppose we have a foundation to run and a wedding to plan. I suppose we do, Alexander agreed, though I should warn you. I'm thinking of making this wedding significantly more elaborate than a restaurant bet. Emma's laugh was pure joy. Well, I should warn you that I'm thinking of inviting some of my piano students to perform at the reception. Perfect. I'll make sure to have several pianos available, just in case you decide to make any more foolish wagers. Alexander pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit in his arms. Emma, I've already made the only wager that matters. I'm betting my heart on us, and this time I'm confident we both win. Outside the practice room windows, Boston autumn afternoon light filtered through the conservatory's historic architecture. But Alexander and Emma only had eyes for each other and the future they would build together. One built on love, trust, and the kind of faith that turns the most impossible gambles into the most beautiful victories.